Rachel, thanks so much for taking the time for joining me back on the podcast again.
Yeah, it's nice to see you again. I was thinking about it and I was like, how many years has it been? And it's probably been close to 6, as near as I can figure.
Yeah, I would say so. And I will admit, I didn't actually go back and check to see how long has it been. It's just, we've
Yeah.
been friends for years now at this point. And, but here we are, we got you back on the show. And I actually have a term that I think I'm going to start using for return guests on the podcast. I think I'm going to start calling you all repeat offenders. So, so you are officially a repeat offender for the All Around Adventure podcast.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny to see with this sort of spacing what things look on the other side. It's been a long time. A lot has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And, kind of speaking of which, when I had you on last time, you were very much kind of living that nomadic kind of lifestyle. You've been living like so many different places. It seems like you are a little bit more situated in one locale for now. And maybe, your audience that typically follow you through Ally Safety may not know this about you, but you've covered a lot of ground as a traveler. So can you kind of sort of fill us in, I guess, as to like what that's been like for you and kind of where you've been before now?
Yeah. So back in my 20s, when I was working as a health and safety professional for larger corporations, I had quit my job to travel 2 different times. So the first time I traveled around the world with a 40-liter backpack for about a year alone and went pretty much all over the world. So everywhere from Bolivia in South America to Southeast Asia, India, China, Nepal, and then all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. And then the second time I did it when I was starting my own business and working remotely. And that was the time when you and I met about 6 years ago. And when you and I met, I was actually at a yoga and meditation retreat in Nepal for a little while. And so a lot has happened since then. And now I am running a business in Vancouver, Washington, kind of spread out between here and a lot of different places in the Pacific Northwest and going all the way back to Montana, where I'm originally from, pretty often.
And of course, you're making your way around the U.S. quite a bit too. So you're not quite entirely stationary. I mean, you were actually in my neck of the woods down here in San Antonio a few months ago. And then from there, you went to Boston or something like that right afterwards. So it doesn't sound like the traveling has ended for you yet. You're still getting out there quite a bit.
I am. And the funny thing is, like, I had a baby last January. And so I thought this year I would be more sedentary and be able to stay in one place. And I was actually ready for a break, but then work really took off this year. So I've been to Texas twice. I've been to the East Coast. I've been to Kentucky for a conference, California. I can't even remember everywhere I've been this year. A lot in the US, but then I just got back from the baby's first international trip, which was to Mexico.
Yeah, I noticed some of your photos, and the little one seems to handle that travel pacing so well. Everything from flying on a plane and just, getting around the cities and in the strollers and in like the backpacks that you all will carry him in. He just seems to take strides so well, it seems.
Yeah, we got lucky. I can't take any credit for that. He is just like a happy little guy and he likes people. So by coincidence, I taught him how to shake hands and high five before this trip. And so like everybody that he saw, they'd be like, high five, high five. And I've never tried to high five a baby before, but apparently people do. And him knowing how to do that made more friends than almost any other travel experience I've ever had before. Like this fat little hand coming out to high five you.
Very cool. Very cool. But one of the things that you sort of brought up was just, you packed up a 40-liter backpack and you were just going like all over the world. And I know a lot of this was by yourself. And, one of the things that we kind of sort of talked about last time that I sort of want to bring up again, because I think it's a pretty important topic, is that, there's a lot of women out there, especially in my life, and I'm sure you know some as well, who may see solo female travelers like you, think it might be cool to get out in the world and see some amazing sights, have some amazing experiences, but the fear of traveling by themselves kind of creeps in and they end up maybe not going and doing anything at all because of it. So if you can take us back a little bit here, what was that like for you traveling by yourself? Was fear an issue that you faced at all? And if so, how did you kind of sort of manage that?
Yeah, I think fear is always an issue when you're like leaving your comfort zone to travel, but a bit more so probably as a solo female traveler, just because physically you are not as imposing as some of the other people out there. And, it's easy to target solo female travelers. So I feel like you have to be a little bit more cautious than, say, a solo male traveler will have to be. So there's definitely times where I had to be more careful, more prepared, and more cautious than I think I would have had to be if I was just a solo male traveler. And it's interesting because as I've traveled to a lot of places that aren't the safest countries alone. So it's not like I spent all my time in Australia or Western Europe. I went to Bolivia and spent like a month in Bolivia. Like I mentioned, India, traveling alone through India and doing local buses and things like that because I was traveling on a budget of like $50 a day. So if you have a bigger budget, you can choose safer options more often. If you have a lower budget, you're generally traveling with the masses and there can be safety in numbers, but there can also be risk in that as well. And so it's been interesting seeing myself and kind of comparing myself to other female travelers and what seems to work and what doesn't. And I'll tell you, I've had very good luck and been very safe in my travels and haven't had a lot of scary close calls, but I know people and have traveled with people who have had poorer luck. And so there's some key differences I would say that are there.
It's interesting how you bring up the point about if you're willing to shell out a little bit more financially, that could mean greater safety. I didn't even really think to bring that up on the podcast before, but I mean, I've even experienced that like myself as a solo male traveler, and I imagine it's got to be much more difficult for a solo female traveler. Where like one of the things traveling around like Europe and other places, especially like if you're a young backpacker in your 20s, hostels are kind of a hot spot because, cheap to stay at. Sometimes you can meet like other travelers too. But on the flip side, though, is just, you are sharing your sleeping quarters with strangers at the end of the day. And, that could, fluctuate and how comfortable some could feel in a situation like that. Because I've actually stayed in hostels where people were eyeing my stuff a little bit too much. They'll be like, ooh, that's a really, really nice camera, and I'm thinking, should I like just bring everything with me if I go out to dinner tonight and not leave anything behind? So there's worries like that. But if you want to maybe shell out a little bit more for a hotel so you have your own space, you could lock your door and know that no one else is sleeping in the same room as you, then that's something to take in consideration as well.
Yeah, I think the sleeping situation is an interesting one. That first time I quit to travel, I was always staying in the budget option. And of course, you can get all girls' rooms in most hostels, which is nice because it's kind of a friendly atmosphere. You meet cool people to hang out with, and there's not that sort of like pickup thing going on that sometimes happens when you're in rooms with guys too. But the thing was that when I was always choosing the more economical option, I was always in rooms with more people, generally like 6 bunks or more. So you're sleeping in groups. And then every now and then, towards the end of my travels, I would be like, I just need some privacy. I just want a room of my own. And it was really scary, actually, to sleep in a room of my own, because if anything happens and you're in a 15-bed dorm, all you have to do is say something or yell and everybody's going to wake up. But when you're alone, you feel very alone. And it's like, how well could somebody hear if I needed help? So
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting consideration too, is it's like there is a certain amount of safety in numbers if you're surrounded by good people, which generally in hostels, they're all other travelers kind of in the same boat. But I would say transportation is maybe a trickier one.
Mm.
And what I've seen is girls who travel on a pretty tight budget like me sometimes will cut corners and not take a cab home at night because they feel safe and they don't want to spend, an extra $5 or whatever. If it's dark, you have to take a cab. That's like my number one rule is like, you don't walk alone in a city at night. And I would say like there's lots of safe cities out there where you're probably fine, but the risk is just higher. And why take that risk? A bad situation is going to ruin your trip. $5 should not be the deciding factor there.
Yeah, because if I want to think about criminal behavior here, I mean, any like would-be criminal out there, they do not want to get caught, trying to impose a criminal act on someone. So typically that would mean nighttime, lower light situations, other people are kind of preoccupied with like other things and not maybe having like situational awareness of like what's going on. I think I heard someone use the term 45-degree culture in this day and age. 45 meaning that our heads are always tilted down at a 45-degree angle looking at our phones. Like, and
Okay.
you see this everywhere. You see it in restaurants and bars. People are on dates and are looking at their phones, or they're walking and looking at their phones too. Or even furthermore, they're wearing like headphones, like while they're walking down the sidewalk at night.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, and not that I would ever do this, of course, but I'm thinking, gosh, if I wanted to like take this person and steal from them, there's nothing they could probably do to stop me. They don't even have their ears and eyes open to look for any
Right.
of these things. So it's
Well, yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Most of us are so unprepared for anything like that. Like it doesn't even really enter our stream of consciousness. And so we would be really easy to take advantage of just by like stealing a purse or whatever. And so it's kind of important. I always think like I haven't taken a lot of self-defense classes, but what I do know is how you present yourself makes a huge difference. So I've seen girls walk down the street, and when a man is approaching them, they put their eyes down and kind of to the side and avoid any sort of eye contact. And I walk forward confidently. And if somebody is kind of like entering what I would consider my space, I turn and look right at them. Because generally, you don't want to be ID'd if you're going to attack somebody, and you don't want to attack somebody who's coming across as confident. So those are things that make a difference, is how you present yourself in just everyday situations as a woman. It's important to make sure that you are presenting yourself as confident.
Agreed. And another way I've heard this said before is like predator versus prey body language. Like
Oh my gosh.
if you think
Yeah.
about like predators like in the wild, like a lion just strodes across the savannah, just upright, powerful, confident, and pretty much just has that opposing appearance behind him. But if you look at prey animals out in the savannah, like the gazelles and everything like that, or even like here in the States, animals like deer and things along those lines, they're very skittish, they're sporadic and everything like that. They just have that behavior about them and their movement patterns that, they're prey, and other predators see that and then they pounce because they know that they're prey and they're the predators. So what you kind of just talked about of just, standing upright, facing forward, keeping your wits about you, not appearing too skittish and just being confident, that just kind of shows it a little bit more that you're just not someone to be messed with. It's like, I see you're not going to get the drop on me on this one.
Yeah. And I think being assertive is important too, because I think women, we're so trained to always be really polite. And have you ever seen The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt?
No.
Okay. So it's a comedy. I think it's on Netflix, and it's about these women who end up like being sort of captured by this religious leader. And they're each telling their story about how they got captured. And it's a comedy. So, take it for what it is. But they're talking about how they got captured, and they're being interviewed on this news program. And this lady's like, well, he told me to come to his van to see some bunnies. And I thought it was a bad idea, but I didn't want to say no because I didn't want to seem rude. And I totally identify with that feeling, because we're never supposed to seem rude. Even if somebody's giving off a creepy vibe, you're not taught to just be assertive and say what you need to say. And there's plenty of situations where even maybe you're just like negotiating with a street vendor and they're getting very aggressive and you have to be assertive. So an example of being assertive is one time I got into a cab in India, and it was not in a major city. It was in a smaller town that I wanted to go to. And I needed to be brought to my hostel, and everything was sketchy. It didn't look like I was used to seeing things look like in other cities. They didn't look like registered cabs. They just looked like somebody's car. And I had gone to the most official looking cab that I could find. And I was not confident getting in that it was what it was saying it was. I just wanted to make sure I had everything. So like I very visibly, with the driver there, took a picture of the licensed cab number. So he knew that I was kind of like keeping an eye on things. And when we got into the cab, I didn't have any cell phone reception. I didn't have any in India or pretty much any other country. And I made a fake phone call, and I'm like, hey, I'm on my way. I'm in cab number XYZ. We should be there in about 15 minutes. So just little things like that, to let the driver know that somebody else knows where you're at and when to expect you can be important. And in that case, I was actually glad I did that, because we ended up not going towards the center of the city where the hostel was. We ended up out in a field, which felt like in the middle of nowhere. And I was asking him, where are we going? Why are we going here? And not in a rude way, but just what is going on? And he explained like we were going around traffic, but it made me a little bit nervous just because the whole situation wasn't what I expected it to be. And I was new to India. Now, I don't know that it would raise quite so many questions, but it was definitely an uncomfortable situation there. And I did get to the hostel just fine and everything was all right. But I felt better knowing that he knew I was paying attention.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about, and I've heard this many times, but it keeps getting brought up because a lot of people don't think to do this. There's the saying, just trust your gut.
Yeah.
If something just feels off to you, then it probably is. And sometimes that very well just may be people that you interact with, like on the street, wherever you travel to. Like if someone is just giving you a bad vibe, it's just like, would you rather just be like rude to like either decline what they're offering or just to like walk away from them as quickly as you can, only just to maybe have that bother you for the next couple hours versus something else that could be potentially much worse than that could probably affect you for maybe even the rest of your life, or like some sort of traumatic event that you can avoid. So yeah, I say just trust your gut. If it doesn't feel right
Yeah.
to you, then it probably isn't. Just get yourself out of there, ego aside and feelings aside, get yourself somewhere safe.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I don't think I ever had to rely on my gut so much in my life as when I traveled, and it does steer you pretty clearly. But on the other side, one thing that I've seen get a lot of solo female travelers in trouble with is romantic relationships.
Mm.
Whether it's with other travelers or with locals, like you gotta be careful. And as an example, I was in a hostel staying in an all-girl dorm with a girl in Peru, and she had gotten together with a guy and was kind of falling for him, so she was emotionally invested in it. And I think they were like making out on the beach one night, and she had her purse to the side, and she said it was like 10 minutes. It wasn't like a long thing, but she looks over and her purse is gone. And it had been one of those situations where it felt like he was involved in that in some way. Like he had told somebody where they were going and had kind of orchestrated it, and she hadn't known him very long. I don't know if he was involved in it or not, but that purse had her credit cards, her passport, all of her cash. And so then she's stranded at the hostel, and like the only person she knows in town is this guy who she doesn't trust anymore. And there end up being a lot of situations like that I've seen women get in, where you're in a romantic situation and you need to be careful and really keep your wits about you. Not that everyone's a predator, they're not. But there are certain people who will prey on travelers who are from some of the more wealthy countries.
Yeah, so I think it's just, setting boundaries beforehand and everything, and kind of just knowing what your limits are. And this is going to be a little bit of an extreme example, but it's one that I personally follow, so people can just sort of just, take what they will from this. But I like to say I use the Mattis principle, and I'm referring to General James Mattis from the Marine Corps. He had a quote, "Be polite and be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody that you meet." And of course,
oh my God.
He's of course referring to like Marines, like over in the Middle East and stuff like that during wartime.
Oh my God.
But a toned down version of this would be, be polite to people that you meet when you're traveling, be polite to the locals and everything. But, just have like those contingencies in place and maybe not be quite so trusting in case someone does try to take, advantage of you or anything like that, or try to harm you in any way. So be polite and be professional, but do have those boundaries in place.
I'm laughing just because this philosophy is so at odds with my career in health and safety. But
maybe
I would
just
say,
a little bit.
Yeah, like was it? I think it's Teddy Roosevelt, if that's right, where he says, "Walk softly but carry a big stick."
I think, or does that go all the way? That probably goes all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, probably. But
does it? Okay.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, everyone's going to have their own variation of that in some way. That quote has prevailed throughout time for a while now.
Yeah. So I would say, like, Also, that's a good way to put it. Like I never want to be that tourist that makes people dislike people from America, or is not
Right. Yeah.
is not caring or kind to their culture. You're a guest, you want to behave well and appreciate the new place that you're in. But yeah, you do have to watch out for yourself for sure.
Yeah, so those are some safety considerations that are a little bit more surface level, but I want to kind of dive a little bit more deep into the practical sense and kind of sort of what this sort of looks like. And you brought up transportation a little bit, and we did talk a little bit about hotels. But I think maybe to some degree, if people are traveling for work as opposed to like let's say traveling for leisure, I don't know if they're quite as on guard when it comes to matters of safety, especially if they're
Yeah,
traveling, let's say domestically versus internationally. But even still, if someone's traveling like in their home country, there are hazards that still exist. I mean, it's just you're not devoid of certain hazards just because you decided not to leave your own country's borders. So
absolutely.
so if we wanted to focus just here stateside for a second, and maybe we'll just kind of, I guess we'll say people who are talking traveling for professional purposes. What are kind of some of like the main hazards that you've kind of observed when people travel for work?
I think it's really interesting because I think often when we travel for work, we approach it with the same sort of mindset that we would do if we're going to our normal job day in and day out. But obviously traveling with work comes with a different set of challenges. And so there's some cultural differences which are important, but there's also like the physical safety side of it. And one thing that we tend to forget about even when we're traveling within the United States is the neighborhood, the people that are around you, where you're staying. And it's interesting because I've worked in places where we've talked quite a bit about employee safety while they travel, and things that I would never personally consider when I travel, they would bring up. So there's a CIA list of safe countries, safe places in the United States where things are ranked and they give advice on where you can go. But some of the other items that are very specific, some people say if you're in a bad neighborhood or are traveling somewhere where there's a high crime rate, don't stay on the first floor of a hotel. And the
Really?
reason is if there's any break-ins or gun violence, it's all going to be on the first floor.
Hmm.
Isn't that
Okay.
crazy? Because
Yeah.
typically hotels are safe. You don't have to worry about it. But let's say there's a drive-by shooting or something. The first floor is going to be where all the trouble is. It always is. Nobody's going to climb up to the third floor. It's just too much work.
Yeah, and again, going back to what I've learned, sort of studying criminal behavior, is the path of least resistance. The
Mm-hmm.
first floor is that path of least resistance. It's like I can run up to a first floor window and smash it and get inside if I wanted to. But
Absolutely.
I'm not gonna like go get myself a ladder to hoist myself up to like any higher floors to do that. That makes no sense.
That's just
So
so much more, so many more details.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
if I could add to that, especially if we're going to focus in on hotels here for a second, is adding security layers to where it is that you're staying. And sometimes I'm kind of selective of like the hotels there. Like I've traveled for work, and I've stayed in hotels that didn't have a lot of these security layers. And I actually asked our
Mm-hmm.
logistics officer, "Can you move us someplace else? Like this place just does not, feel right to me." Where a lot of them were missing like security like latches inside the doors to like to give like an extra lock on the door.
Oh,
You
I
know,
think that's against building code or some sort of a law with hotels.
Yeah, it very
Yeah.
well could have been. And of course, this is just one of those like cheap roadside motels. So everything is on the first floor. And I'm not trying to knock people who own those types of establishments by any means, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just there was only one lock on the door. And of course, going back to what we talked about earlier when it comes to finances, sometimes if you're spending less on certain accommodations, it could draw maybe like the not the most favorable characters to those types of establishments as well. I mean, it just kind of
Yeah.
sort of is what it is. But yeah, it's just so going back to adding layers. If you can get yourself on a higher floor than the first, and if you have like multiple locks on the door, that's more preferable. Or even if you want to take a step above, I know some people like to travel with like those rubber door stoppers to like put them behind the door before they go to bed. So that way, if someone tries to
Yeah.
kick in that door, that at least buys them a few more precious seconds to respond accordingly when they're getting out of a groggy sleep state to, deal with the threat.
It's interesting to me because a lot of this initially will probably sound to most people a little bit crazy, but things happen.
Hmm.
And even just having that secondary lock, like you're talking about, is important. Think about it like sometimes people will just walk down a hotel trying doors to see what they can get in. And I've even had it where I'm in my hotel room and somebody else is given the wrong door number or key and can get in. And they walk in and you're there just like, hello, can I
That's
help
happened to
you?
me too. Yeah.
Yeah, it happens a surprising amount. So being able to just lock it and know that you're secure when you're in the shower gives you peace of mind. It's that simple. Other things like renting a car. Are you renting a safe car? Are you renting a car that has the right airbags and crash test rating? Because the biggest cause of fatalities throughout the United States is transportation accidents. So if you can not get the base model that's like a tiny, tiny car and get something that's a little bit bigger, a little bit more safe, you're generally better off.
Yeah, and then also one thing I like to do because especially now with my new job, I believe I told you just last month I just started a new position with a different organization, but I'm driving to a lot more places that I am flying this time around, and so I wonder if the folks at Enterprise are just like waiting for me to leave, but it's like I'll usually be in like whatever car I'm renting for about like a good like 10, 15 minutes. And if they pull it up to one of those like drive-through lanes that they have on one of the buildings, I'll usually just pull into one of their parking spots and just, check everything. It's like make sure that my seat is adjusted the way I want it to, make sure that the steering wheel is in a good position to where, it's not going to impose my movements or how I steer. I can see the mirrors just well, they're positioned correctly. And then also, I grew up in the era of analog, and I swear, Rachel, like all the stuff that they put in the vehicles these days, it's basically the Starship Enterprise in there. And so just making sure I have at least like some familiarity, like if I want to use the navigational systems or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be, it's like I don't want to be fiddling with any of that stuff while I'm trying to drive to wherever it is I need to go.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a little learning curve to every different make and model that you drive. One other thing I will add to this that people don't think about when they travel is there's a lot of back injuries and shoulder injuries with travel, which you
Really?
wouldn't necessarily think of. But think of it like you're carrying a suitcase, even a carry-on size suitcase can easily be 30 pounds. You're lifting it up high, which is what we call in the danger zone, where it's high enough where it's easier to get injured.
You better
And
call Kenny
then
Loggins.
I know. And so you're in this situation where you're probably lifting more than you're used to for a lot of us, especially those in office jobs. And then you're sitting in cars that you probably aren't adjusting the seats correctly either. So you go home, you've got neck aches from sleeping on a different bed, different pillows, back aches from like carrying around this big suitcase, and then you're driving in a car that you're not used to that may not be set up for you. So you haven't adjusted it. And you go home with all these aches and pains. And I knew a guy that I used to work with. He actually threw his back out getting out of the car on a work trip. And
Mm.
he threw it out in a really serious way. Like he was not a complainer. This was not an attempt to get a workers' comp claim. He threw it out so bad he had to go to the hospital just getting out of a
Wow.
car. So, like all of these different situations combined can result in a lot of discomfort and even some mild strains and sprains that have to be treated. It happens more often than you'd think. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself ergonomically. And ladies, sometimes that means swapping out something like a heavy purse or laptop bag for a backpack that's work appropriate. That can really make a big difference.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I didn't even think about that very much before is that, yeah, ergonomics are usually something that most people would think of with, yeah, the office type jobs, making sure, your office chair is set up at like a certain degree angle and that, your field of view is right in line with your computer screen. So you're not, tilting your head over too much and so on and so forth. Or those big wide keyboards that, with the little foam cushion wrist rests and everything like that. I've definitely been in places where ergonomics were very big in the office. But yeah, it's just doing it while on the move. There's a lot that goes into it too, because you could be in that car for however long it takes to get where somewhere. I've had to like drive for as long as 8 hours before to get to some
Yeah.
places, if not longer. So
Yeah, and 8 hours in a day is definitely going to leave you with some aches and pains and not at your best. And then you're probably doing work that you don't do on a typical day to day. And so all those things add up. Another thing that I think is super important to talk about that it doesn't matter if you're traveling for work or for fun, this doesn't get talked about enough is alcohol and drugs.
Mm.
Drugs probably secondary in workplace travel, but it's still a big one. But I see people over and over and over put themselves in really bad situations for alcohol and drugs on vacation and at work travel. So, maybe you're going to a conference in Vegas, maybe you're going to a conference like here in Portland, Oregon. I was speaking at a conference last Thursday and the crowd was a bit quiet, but I was the first speaker of the day. So you kind of expect it'll take them a while. It'll take them a little while to warm up.
Sure.
But somebody came up to me after and I thought that everything went pretty well. They did warm up. They were a great crowd, but somebody came up after and they said, "Hey, sorry about how everybody was so tired at the beginning. They all went out drinking last night and they're super hungover today."
Mm.
It is so typical. I mean, there's nothing surprising about this one, but of course, then you have the added risk of however you behave when you drink, which everybody has their their certain behavior patterns. Then you're dehydrated. Then you're not feeling well. You've probably got stomach upsets to deal with as well. So those situations add a lot of risk and cause a lot of problems on work travel trips. A lot of times people don't want to admit it. If you're a solo female traveler, drinking too much, partying too much, that is one that I've seen get so many girls in trouble. Is just you have to keep your wits about you. You can't let go and just think somebody else is going to take care of it and make sure you get home at the end of the night, because that's just not the reality.
Right. Yeah. And, especially depending on what someone is doing for work, like, I don't know if I would say I would give like more leeway towards some professions versus others. I mean, obviously, if you're going into work hungover and your job requires you to like operate heavy machinery and things along those lines, I mean, obviously, you're really setting yourself up for and others for a real world of hurt there. If you're in that state and you're expected to, have surgical precision with an excavator or something along those lines too. But yeah, it's like I agree with you. I see this like many, many times over, and it's just like, and I hate to say this, and I don't mean to sound too disparaging, but it's like I can't count on people who show up to work like that. It's just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that slows down like a lot of progress, because I'll be like, look, I can't put you, to work right now because you're going to probably get someone hurt, just as much as yourself, and I can't allow that. So you either have to go home, and you probably won't collect any compensation today since you're not putting in any hours. And, it's like, I hate when I have to do that to people. And there's actually been some instances where I've had to remove people for projects for behavior like that too. It's not to say that they're, bad at their job necessarily, but it's just that type of behavior. It's just unsafe. And that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, it is. And then it just complicates everything. I think it's interesting because, obviously, well, we haven't talked about this, but I work with an industrial population. So a lot of people who are in the trades and stuff. But we still drug test and alcohol test people in management pretty often, but it's not talked about as much. Like sometimes you're making multi-million-dollar decisions and you shouldn't be making those hungover.
Right. All right. So, I guess if I can just kind of zoom in on you now, especially with your line of work and or what you do now for your business, and maybe other people who are traveling maybe in the same boat, but it's just one of the big differences between when I first had you on the podcast versus now that you brought up earlier is that you are now actually a mom, and your young son comes with you a lot when you do these work trips. So what about safety considerations that you've kind of implemented, now that you are a mother, and what would you kind of recommend to other people who may be traveling with kids? And I guess this could be applicable to just like both the work sense and also just like the personal travel sense too.
Yeah, it's harder with kids, of course. It's just more complicated because you're traveling with so much stuff. You have to bring the car seat along, which you don't usually think about yet. We have like a hockey bag that we keep the car seat and all of his stuff in. And that's a huge hassle in itself when you're used to being a light traveler. But thinking about how are they going to be safe in their transportation? How are you going to keep them from falling? So we just got back from Mexico and my son is 10 months old and he is like carrying around a little octopus right now. He is always wanting to wiggle and crawl and be on the go, and he pulls himself up to standing all the time. And we were on all these tile floors. And so if he falls, he's going to fall hard and probably hit his head, because that's how it goes. Even if they fall on their booty first, they like fall back and hit their head.
Right.
So just little things like, is there a safe place where he can crawl and play so he's not losing his mind being contained all the time? And then getting a pack and play in every room. So you kind of have to check ahead to say, make sure that the hotels have them, because otherwise they're sleeping on the hotel bed with you. He's big enough. He's like, my baby's really big. He's like in the 99th percentile.
Oh,
So you're
wow.
not going to roll over on him necessarily. He's kind of out of the woods with that risk. But there's always that risk when they're smaller. And then also him rolling off the bed is really dangerous as well. So you always try to get the pack and play or a proper crib for the kids while you're traveling. And then we try to supply a lot of the food. I'm a pretty laid back person overall, so I'm not dogmatic about it, but it does just help to keep them on an even level and happier if it's food that they're used to overall.
So a lot of like meal prepping kind of comes with that, which I would imagine would be simpler for road trip travels. But what about for flying? Has that been a big challenge there?
It was harder when he was littler, like when he was mostly like drinking milk and the occasional puree and stuff like that. But now he's eating a lot of real food. And so we give him a little bit of whatever we're eating. We just had to be more careful in Mexico about certain things because, there's more potential for food poisoning there. But he did really well with it. So that worked out, knock on wood.
Well, and I'm sure like as he gets older, and it sounds like you're developing some more streamlined approaches to that too, because I mean, with what you do, you're going to be getting out there quite a bit and traveling. I'm sure you're going to want to bring them along, and I think it just comes with experience, not just in the sense of traveling with kids, but just traveling in general too. Like if you're someone who hasn't done it before, a lot of what we're talking about may be a little bit sluggish at first, but you do it enough. You find, your own little tweaks that you can add here and there, and you just streamline the process to make it more safe.
Yeah, I think it really helps to practice. It was interesting because we were talking to another couple whose daughter had taken like 17 flights within her first year. She was a really big traveler from the time she was really small. So we were trying to count up how much Herschel had traveled. And it's not that much, but I can't remember where we landed. But every trip helps you to get a little bit better at it. The difficult thing with kids is they change so fast. So you think you have it down and then you need to evolve really fast.
Wow, 17 flights in the first year. I think I might have achieved that feat when I was like 25, maybe.
Right. I mean,
Something
it's
like
the
that.
same for me. Like, wow, that kid is like pro.
Yeah, that is so weird to think about, but I think that's happening quite a bit more and more. Is that a lot of people are getting out there and traveling with their kids, and which I think is really good because I feel that kids learn best, and I'm more or less speaking for myself here, but I always found like I retained a lot more, and I just got more out of like experiences in the real world as opposed to just like having someone try to give me information in a classroom. So, and
Oh, yeah.
no disrespect to teachers or anything like that, but it's just I think the real world is where kids will pick up the most stuff the quickest and retain it better.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I always think I learned more traveling than I ever learned in school, history wise, and probably politically as well. So it's good that way. And then also, I mean, I want him to appreciate it, like appreciate travel, because for me, it was so important and I learned so much from it. I don't want it to be something that's taken for granted necessarily, but to be able to learn about the world when you're younger versus like me, it took till my mid-20s for me to be able to see how big the world was. That would be really valuable, I would think. It'd be nice.
Yeah, well, it's not just like in the realms of academic information or too, but just like self-development and building your character, as I say, because with you and I having traveled the world as solo travelers, I mean things like problem solving, decision making, and also just dealing with stressful situations that are inevitably going to arise when we're out traveling, because everyone has their misadventure stories in some
Yeah.
way, shape, or form. And but then of course when those situations arise, you're by yourself. It's like figure it out,
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really good to have those and also to learn to get along with people who are different than you and think differently and are from a
Right.
totally different background, because it's easy to get siloed. And, if you have to reach across to somebody who's very, very different and establish rapport, that's great.
Yeah, and I think you and I have observed this when you talk about the silo effect. When we go out and travel the world, go overseas, have some amazing experiences, we may come back, stateside, and you and I are both small town kids, and so like,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you probably had situations where you want to share these experiences with people back home, but they may not be able to entirely relate to it because, they may not have expanded their radius quite as far from like the hometown that they grew up in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I've experienced a lot of that where you're so excited. And I'm not somebody who talks about my travels a lot with people who haven't also traveled to that same place because I feel like I don't want to be that person, but even when you want to say, like, oh, what have you been doing? It's like, oh, well, I just got back from here and now I'm doing XYZ. Uh, you just find like certain people are either very uncomfortable with it, they're threatened by it, or they have a weird perception of what that place may be like.
Mhm.
Like I've talked to people who even are like, well, I'd really like to go to Paris, but I don't know with how the world is going lately. I don't think I'd ever feel safe leaving the US. And I'm like, I think Paris is like, if you look at the country safety rankings, the US is not super high on that. And
We're
going to
really
Western
not.
Europe
No.
is generally safer. You might get pickpocketed though. That's definitely more possible over there. But other than that, you're probably fine.
Yeah, I actually, speaking of which, a few days ago, I'm currently researching my next international trip. I won't say where I'm thinking about going
Okay.
just yet. I'll tell you offline, but I'm going to try to leave it
Okay.
as a surprise for our audience. But yeah, I did pull up the Global Peace Index, and for anyone who may not know this, and I'll include a link for it in the show notes. But yeah, it is that ranking. It's a ranking system. I don't think it's like the only ranking system, of course, where they will look at certain metrics for different countries, talking about things like crime rates, poverty rates,
Mhm.
and different markers, and give them like a ranking, like a 1 to 5 ranking, and then whoever has like the lowest score would basically be considered like the safer or more peaceful countries, and the higher scores are the more dangerous countries, so to speak. And so number one is countries like Iceland. Like Iceland is a very, very safe country. When I traveled there, someone told me that their murder rate is like 1.5, like every single year. And I'm like, okay, what's the 0.5 there for exactly? Did you like half murder someone? I don't know. Anyway, so safe country. But then, yeah, I was remembering scrolling down that list, and I'm like, again, I can't remember exactly where the U.S. fell in that list, but I had to scroll down quite a bit to get to it.
Yeah,
So,
you do. And on the flip side of that, it was so interesting. I was in Vietnam and I was talking to a British girl once. And we were talking about the US because she had asked me where I was from. And she's like, oh, I'd love to visit someday, but I'm terrified of guns. I'm like, well, we're not all walking down the street like John Wayne. But then again, there are awful lot of shootings that take place, and they see them in the news all the time. And so it's just funny to see that flip side where somebody wouldn't travel to the US because they think it's so dangerous. And, honestly, the mall where I do a lot of my shopping has had a mass shooting at it. Like there's some credibility to that in some ways.
yeah, I mean, of course, being on the ground on location will be the best indication for yourself as to how you feel about a country versus like what you may see like on the news and everything like that. But yeah, I agree. I can see where a lot of these concerns do come from, but it just goes
Mhm.
back to what you and I have been talking about this episode so far is like, do take those precautions like, ahead of time and, do your research and, you
Get
know,
travel insurance.
travel insurance, and also the State Department has their smart traveler system where
Yes.
you can enroll with the embassy and everything like that in the country, the U.S. embassy in the country that you go to. And I even kind of take it a step above, but normally, depending on where I am, I won't do this in some places, but there have been some places that I've gone to that I would say are less safer than other destinations out there, where I
Mhm.
will actually make it a point to, before I go out and do my big exploration, I would actually walk to where the US embassy is and actually get eyes on it and see where like the front entrance is. So that way, if something were to pop off at any moment, then, I can go straight there and,
Yeah,
be back in US territory again.
I don't always sign up for the Department of State travel notifications. I have in certain countries, and it's a good thing to do that I don't think they talk enough about if you're traveling internationally and there is even a hint of unrest, you do want to sign up for that because you are going to be prioritized in getting out because you'll have more people who know where you are. The Department of State will know, and that's super important. So as an example, one time I was flying into Thailand and there were like soldiers all over the streets with machine guns. And I've
Hmm.
been to Thailand several times and this was unusual. And so I went on the Department of State, told them I was there, got more information on what was going on, why it was happening, and just stayed informed. And everything was fine, but they knew I was there and I knew I had more current information than you can get on the news. And so if you're watching the news now, and you're hearing more about what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip, those American tourists who were over there were put in a very, very scary situation. But the Department of State is usually who gets them out if something like that happens. And if you're accounted for, they'll get you out faster. So it's the same thing with getting travel insurance. So I am not endorsed by World Nomads, but I always get travel insurance through World Nomads. So it does help protect your belongings and your trip, but more importantly, it helps to provide insurance if you have a health condition and something happens while you're overseas. And it also helps to get you out if there is a serious situation. And it seems like, oh, that's so unlikely. And it is very unlikely, but it's a big deal. And a lot of countries aren't as stable as we think that they are. So it's worth having. And it's usually like a couple $100 for a 2-week trip. It's not that much.
Right. And then, of course, the smart enrollment is a free program too with the State
Yeah.
Department. So, definitely no cost up front there. And, another case study is, well, myself, a few years ago, I actually was on the ground in Israel. I mean, of course, this is well
Oh,
before,
really?
yeah, this is well before everything that we're seeing right now. And I was just like out and about, like on a tour. And then, yeah, my phone goes off. It's a text message, and it was from the State Department. And they had just got wind that, like, back in Tel Aviv where I was staying. Like I wasn't in Tel Aviv when I got this alert. I was somewhere else, but there was like a man that was in Tel Aviv that was actually just running down the street and actually straight up stabbing people.
Oh my
And
gosh. Yeah.
yeah, just like a crazy event took place in the city that like I had rented my hotel at. But obviously that was something for me to be aware of, was that, things are probably going to be a little bit hectic as like, police were, trying to process this scene, try to apprehend the suspect and try to, provide treatment to those who were wounded. And, but I got an alert for that. So that obviously just kind of reminded me, is like, okay, yeah, don't be too, light on this trip here because stuff's going on. And, and it was just nice to know that I was kind of getting like those updates as they were happening. And again, well before like I could have seen anything on the news, because I was like I said, I was on a bus, like with no
Yeah.
TV or anything like that. So it was nice to get it.
Yeah, for sure. And, I know a lot of this to so many travelers is going to seem like very unlikely to affect them. But just as an anecdotal piece of evidence, when I was traveling, there were several weeks there where I was 1 week away from international incidents in multiple places. So I went to Nepal, hiked to Annapurna Base Camp, and it was like 3 days after I got back from that, there was an avalanche and it killed something like, I can't remember, 3 or 4 people, and it had trapped like 9 or something on that same trail. And so that was like right after I left, and I was in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong had all these crazy protests, and you had to be in the downtown area to really see it. But everybody's like, are you seeing what's on the national, international news? And I wasn't seeing any of it. But if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, sometimes you get caught up in that stuff very accidentally. And so it's good in those cases to have those connections, have that insurance, know that if something does go sideways, you at least have a plan or some contacts who know where you are, other than your family, who's probably not going to be sure how to react to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, or won't be able to react quickly enough to actually really do anything while you're on the ground facing these threats.
Right. Or in my case, often like I was traveling so much then, I didn't really have hardly anybody who knew where I was. because like my family might know, oh, she's in Thailand, but they wouldn't know where, or Rachel's in India, but they wouldn't necessarily know where. And maybe that's where I was a couple days ago, but I'd moved on. So telling somebody where you're at is important, but you want to tell somebody who is proficient and would be able to take action and know what to do if you went missing.
Right. And, sometimes that might involve just preparing for contingencies like that. And,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had a little bit of a shortcoming myself too. You just made me think of this when you brought up the point where it's like you went somewhere and, a big protest was taking place. And now here you are, a foreigner in this foreign land with this, civil unrest happening. That happened when I went to Germany one time. And, like I was living in the UK going to grad school, and I have a really good friend that lives in Germany, and he invited me out there to have Christmas with him and his family. And so I fly into the Dresden airport, and he's late picking me up. And he said, "Hey, sorry, I'll be there soon. I got a little bit held up with the demonstrations happening in the city." And I'm like, "Demonstrations? Like, what are you talking about?"
Yeah.
And then of course, where they were taking place was where we needed to go to get the tram transportation to actually go to his subdivision where he lived. And so we took the train to the city center, and then it was chaos as soon as we got out of there. There's like this huge crowd of protesters. There's police clad in riot gear, like just all over the place. There's those big SWAT vehicles with the giant water hoses on top of them, rolling in heavy too. And we had to
Yeah.
try to navigate our way through this to try to get to the tram so we can get out of there. And I was actually exhausted from traveling that day. I had to get up like around 4 o'clock that morning to take a train from York, England to Manchester to get a flight to Dusseldorf, and then from Dusseldorf to Dresden. So I was exhausted. And but suddenly I'm like perk right back up again to try to keep my wits about me. And now the funny thing about that situation was this took place on a Monday night. And apparently this particular group that stages these protests only do it on Mondays for whatever reason. So they just happen to do it on the day that I was coming in. So, but the thing is, where I kind of sort of realized I fell short there is like, since I was going to Germany, which I think many people would deem as a safe country, that's not something that would necessarily come to mind for people who are traveling there as a situation that they might face. And so I kind of did let my guard down a little bit in my planning and didn't really think about contingencies like that. Of course, now that's something I'm looking at like a little bit more closely when I travel internationally or even here stateside. It's just like, what's kind of sort of the social landscape of like the city or the country that I'm going to? Like, is there some divisiveness happening where these types of things may come up a little bit more?
Yeah, interesting. Because I think about those things. There's some things that are harder to plan for than others. And another one is weather, which, like I have the worst tornado I ever saw was in Minnesota. And that was when I was traveling for a conference. And they evacuated the hotel, have everybody go down to the basement level, kind of shelter in place. And how it all played out is we were in the restaurant of the hotel that had these big glass windows, kind of like this nice, open, airy restaurant. And you just saw all this lawn furniture start rolling past. And there was an expo outside. So there was carnival rides, there was furniture, there was tents, and it was just nuts to see the power of that wind. And it blew one of the doors that was just kind of closing all the way open and came in the restaurant. And it took three guys going up to this door and wrenching on it to get it shut again. So we all go towards the lobby. The guy in the lobby tells everybody to evacuate down to the basement. And then he starts putting it on the loudspeakers as well, that you have to go down to the basement. And there were kids outside when this happened because there was a carnival. And so there's like two dads in the lobby who are running around frantically looking for their kids outside in this tornado. And it didn't last super long. It passed over. They were able to find the kids, but there was like, I think that one of the rides tipped over, and then there was a trailer that had tipped over in the parking lot, so it happens really quick and you don't always expect it. And I got to be honest, Minnesota is not the first place I think of when I think of tornadoes.
No, yeah. And, we also had a tornado when I was living in North Florida too, which, Florida, I would think hurricanes as a hazard, but not tornadoes. But then lo and
Yeah.
behold, tornadoes as well. And then, of course, when you're dealing with weather, you're dealing with so much unpredictability too. I mean, it's just, I always say, Mother Nature, she just doesn't care. Like, she doesn't care, what kind of day that you're having, or she doesn't care how much money you have or what you look like, nothing. She's going to do her thing, and we have no idea exactly, where she's going to go and how she's going to, plan things out for us. I mean, we could predict certain things, of course, but it's just like, a while back, I had Chelsea Burnett on the podcast. She's a storm chaser that I welcomed on the show. And she was telling me about tornadoes. And she said that the most powerful tornadoes are going to be the ones that are on the ground longer than any of the other ones. So it's like an EF4 tornado. She said she followed an EF4 for like 90 whole minutes that this thing was on the ground for. And that if you're dealing with like an EF5, or if anyone's watched the movie Twister, they call it in the movie the finger of God. That could be on the ground for like about 2 hours, and that's like that's like the most powerful tornado that could be formed. And but of course, you get those smaller tornadoes like an EF1, which may be on the ground for like a couple of minutes, doesn't deal with a whole lot of damage. And the thing is with tornadoes that I also learned from her that I didn't know before is that you can't really quite fully assess the power of the tornado until after the fact. Like after a tornado leaves, that's when damage assessments are done, and that's when they give it like that enhanced Fujita scale designation. But because like how in like the movie Twister, and side note, a lot of people have actually not seen that movie. I'm surprised how many people I asked if they've seen that movie and they haven't. But anyway, in the movie, like they're talking about what type of tornado it is before they even go out after it. They're like, oh, we got one touching the ground right now. We got an F3. Let's go get this F3. That's actually not how it works in real life. So just going back to the unpredictability of Mother Nature is that, if you're facing a very, very powerful tornado, you may have to endure for quite a while before it lets up.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. And I have seen that movie, but I didn't know that's how they worked. The other thing to think about that is funny, like tornadoes, is earthquakes. Like you don't know how bad the earthquake is going to be until you're in the middle of it. And obviously we can't do much to prevent them, but just knowing what an earthquake feels like can be really helpful. So I've been in several earthquakes, and it's a weird, disorienting feeling. One time I was in a small earthquake, and it just sounded like a really loud, like diesel truck had started outside the window, which sounds so bizarre, but it was just this really loud rumbling, and you could kind of feel vibrations coming off the window. But that's as much as that one was. And then I was at a more serious one at a gas station once. And it was like when the whole ground is shaking, you're not sure what's happening at first, because you're like, is this me or is this what's actually happening? And the only way to tell what was going on was to look at the street signs, and the signs were all waving back and forth. So that was like the first indication, okay, this is an actual earthquake. But a lot of times we're disoriented when things like this happen at first, and we're not sure how to react. So there's always going to be that gap. And it's not something where I always have a plan in place, but it's interesting because when I travel around people that are former military, they generally do think through a lot of scenarios. And so as an example, I've noticed if you're sitting at a meal with somebody who's from the military, maybe you can identify with this, Josh, they will position themselves so their back's not to the door.
Right.
And so like us civilians, we aren't thinking that way, but other people do. And they're more prepared. They're more on it. They're more aware of what can go wrong versus I'm like, I want to sit where the nicest view is.
Yeah, and you just made me think of something that, and I've read about this in other like books and literatures and YouTube and everything from other people. They talk about the dangers of denial, where there's that saying, well, it won't happen to me, it'll happen to someone else, and so it's like, well, you could very much be that someone else to someone else who said the exact same thing, and there was this story that happened. This is a true story too. This happened in Thailand. I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2004, but there was like a really big earthquake that happened like out in the Indian Ocean.
The tsunami.
And the really big tsunami. There was this one beach where this husband and wife and this little girl were walking, and the little girl noticed that the water was receding like from the beach. and she had actually literally learned about tsunamis and its effects like in school 2 weeks prior to this family vacation. And she is like frantically screaming like at her parents that they need to get out of there, that a tsunami is coming and everything. But her parents were kind of in that like denial state where it's like, they were in vacation mode. They weren't thinking. They were on a beautiful beach in
Yeah.
Thailand.
It's
They're
hard to
not.
switch gears.
Yeah, they're not thinking, hazard prevention or anything like that. And it was only finally until like the girl's father gave in. He went and talked to he went and told the whole TEL staff member about like what his daughter had said, and they ended up like taking that seriously, and they evacuated the entire beach.
Wow.
And I think that day when the tsunami did hit, I think that one particular beach was the only beach that didn't see any casualties during that
That's
entire event.
crazy. I never heard
Yeah.
about that. That's super interesting, though. And it's good they actually listened, because I think as a parent, it would be easy to be like, yeah, you learned about it in school, but that, does that really match what we're seeing here? Because you wouldn't know. You've never experienced it before. But, like you called it the danger of denial. In the safety industry, we talk about complacency a lot, which is kind of the same thing, that, oh,
Right.
it won't happen to me mindset. And as you know, I've dealt with like quite a bit of tragedy within my family through accidents and things like that. And my sister and I were talking, and we were trying to figure out, like, realistically, like, how can you deal with it? Deal with more unexpected. Is this likely to happen again? Those sorts of situations where, maybe somebody that you love gets into an accident or a car wreck or something along those lines. Like, how can you handle it, and how can you prepare mentally even for those things? And it's difficult because I feel like in day-to-day life, we need to be able to have the optimism that things will go as they have gone before. And, being able to enjoy the day-to-day without being filled with worry and things like that. But you also need to address that, that there are a lot of unforeseen things that can happen. Bad things do happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Difficult times arise for all of us. And so if you can just keep that in mind and prepare yourself as well as possible and decrease the likelihood of it happening, that's the best you can do. And that can give you a lot of peace of mind.
Right. And I especially noticed that if we're going to go back to, let's just say, talking about work trips here, and then maybe also this could translate towards like the end of a vacation. Let's say you're driving home and you're excited to go home and everything. And, oftentimes corners are cut to try to make it faster or whatever the case may be. And especially when I travel for work, in my day job as an archaeologist, we'll usually do like 8 days worth of field work before we get like a few days off. And normally a lot of like the either the near misses or maybe even incidents may happen towards like those last couple of days, because it's just at that point fatigue sets in. Their mind is just thinking, outside of work, like what they need to do when they get home or what they want to do when they get home and they can relax and everything. That's where their mind is. Their mind is not on the task at hand. And that's usually where like they'll bump into things, or like they'll swing their shovels, like not in a correct way or whatever the case may be. But
this is
I do notice
statistically
that.
proven.
Mhm.
It's super interesting. So this is a really Debbie Downer statistic, and I'm sorry to share this, but you're more likely to get hurt at work the day before you leave to go on vacation, and you're more likely to get the flu or a viral illness after you've left on vacation, because when you're about to go on vacation at work, you're distracted, you're rushing, maybe you're having some complacency because it's your last day before vacation, so you're more likely to make mistakes. Then when you're finally on vacation, you finally let your body relax. And so any of that viral load that maybe you've been carrying, that you've been kind of able to hold off, once you really relax, your body kind of lets down its defensives and you're more likely to get sick those first few days. So it's a bummer. You can prevent those things from happening, but it's definitely a truism that those things happen closer to vacation and when you're on vacation.
Well, that certainly makes sense, because I think there's a lot of stress in those like days leading up to vacation with, making sure you secure everything at work, and, you're trying to make sure all your plans are in place for when you actually do go on vacation. So you're basically trying to cram so much. Your mind is just, being flooded with stress and all those hormones and everything like that, which, as we know, stress can compromise the immune system. So that does make sense.
The interesting thing about this too is any cases where there is the potential for a domestic abuse can actually get worse on vacation if you're vacationing with family, or even just somebody who is psychologically unstable. They can be destabilized by traveling because for a lot of us, our daily routine really keeps us on an equilibrium throughout the day. You know what to expect. You kind of have the same routine, and it's actually a really good stabilizing force in a lot of people's lives. But when you go on vacation, everything's new, everything's different. You know, you're hungry, you can't find food, things, you're not sleeping the same as you would. And everybody tends to get a little bit on edge. So, on the psychological side of things, not to say that domestic violence is like people's number one concern when traveling, it's not, but that's just an extreme example. If you want to make sure that your vacation and your travel, whether for work or for fun, is more enjoyable, have a few mileposts in the day where your routine will be similar to what it is at home. So let's say you're off your time zone by 2 or 3 hours. That's something you can't really help, but maybe you do things at the same time of day as you would at home. So, if your routine is first thing in the morning, you get yourself a cup of coffee, do that when you're on vacation. Or if your routine is, you watch half an hour of TV every day to de-stress, do that when you're on vacation too. It's just those little things that make you feel more like you have the security of home overall that can make your trip better, more enjoyable, and go smoother than if you just let go of everything that stabilizes your day-to-day life.
Right. And that also could just mean, planning vacations accordingly and looking into those things where, I mean, part of what I think makes for, good, meaningful, memorable adventures is, getting out of your comfort zone and experiencing
Yes.
all kinds of things. But I would say don't throw yourself like if you're new to traveling, I guess maybe I'll throw in that caveat here. It's just maybe you don't want to throw yourself in the deep end, right? Like from the get-go. Especially if, you are getting taken out of your routines and everything. A lot of your routines and what you're used to is easily
Right.
getting disrupted, like you mentioned, where it's like maybe you have like certain, even as something as simple as like maybe you have certain dietary restrictions that you have for yourself. And then it's like maybe if you practice a certain diet and you travel someplace and then you get on the ground and realize, oh, people here don't really follow these diet. Maybe they don't have like vegan options like at the restaurants here. That's just not really a thing in this part of the world. So it's like, well, now what? Because it's
Yeah.
like
Do you have a
you had that
plan?
routine back at home. Now that routine is disrupted. So look into that
Yeah.
ahead of time too.
So the interesting thing is, I think the first time I was on your podcast, I was like, sometimes you have to let go of those routine things that keep you from traveling. And I still agree with that. Like we travel to experience something new. So it's not like you want to be the same person and you want to wake up at the same time of day and do exactly the same things. But a few of those items will make your trip better and make you enjoy it more. And I want to ask you this because I think this is interesting. Do you work out when you travel?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So see, like that's one thing you've committed to it. You know that you can keep your same physical level of activity. Probably it may be different. You probably don't have all the resources that you would have at home, but that's an important way that you are still maintaining certain levels of your familiarity, your fitness, all those important things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Rachel, we've just capped over an hour of talking, and I think we're still very much scratching the surface on all the stuff that we can talk about when it comes to travel safety. So I think if you could just maybe tell our audience, really quick, where can they find you if they maybe want to do some follow-ups with you? I mean, like I said, you got Ally Safety out there. You got stuff that you're putting out on YouTube. So yeah, where
Yeah.
can we connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on all the socials at Ally Safety. That's ALLY Safety. And then I have my YouTube channel where I talk a lot about different safety topics. A lot of them are geared towards heavy industry, but every now and then we'll do something that's more of a broad audience. For example, we have winterizing your vehicle coming up soon. So kind of fun stuff. Yeah, and just anything safety related.
All right, and I'll get all those linked up in the show notes for this episode. And I definitely will recommend, for everyone to check out, your YouTube channel. Just because the information that you put out there is solid, and also, the production quality as well of your videos that you upload is very good. So, well done, my friend.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. All right. Well, as we get into the wrap up of our conversation, one thing I like to do, and I don't know, I can't remember if I did this with you last time you were on the show, but I like to ask my guests to issue a challenge to our listeners because as I say, information, stories, and ideas can only take our listeners and our viewers so far. Action has to follow up when they're done listening to this conversation to go out and do amazing things in life. So with that, what challenge would you issue to our listeners today for them to go out there and start living a more adventurous life?
I would say you can definitely live an adventurous life, but with your travel, think of one thing to make it a little bit more safe and secure. So that's going to make it so you can enjoy your travel. You can have a little bit more peace of mind. And then also make sure that you can get out there and try things that are a little bit more edgy and adventurous next time if you start developing good habits now.
Right, absolutely. And like we talked about, we're going to include some resources. We did talk about some resources earlier in this conversation with the Global Peace Index, with the SMART enrollment program. Those will be listed in the show notes. And then, of course, your resources as well with what you're putting out there through Ally Safety. So that'll be linked up as well. All right. And so next up, we have our final three. And you've answered these questions before, but I actually can't remember what your answers were. I didn't even think to go back and check what your answers were. It's been a while. So I'm curious to see if they actually might be different than what you mentioned last time. And the first of these three questions is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
That's so hard, but I think, I don't know. I think I miss Norway the most of all. Yeah, I loved northern Norway, like way up in the Lofoten Islands. It was so cool.
All right, very cool. I still have yet to get there, but that country seems to be coming across my radar more and more as a destination.
Yeah, I would definitely get out of Oslo, fly up to the Lofoten Islands, and stay for a week in a little cabin in the middle of nowhere. It's amazing.
All right, good to know. All right, the next question. What is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
I think the one that's really frustrating is get to Brazil. I've been to Amazon from the Amazon basin from the Bolivia side, but I want to go to like the Amazon basin proper and really get into the Amazon. And every time I try to go, I can't get a visa because the Brazilian visa system was so slow. But since COVID, you don't really need a visa anymore. So I just need the baby to be big enough to want to take along.
to get all up in there in the jungle. So
yeah.
I don't know. Your boy's pretty big. I'm pretty sure he can handle himself just well.
He's pretty robust, but he would be very tasty for some predators. So we need to make sure he's a little bit bigger before we go.
Copy that. All right. And the last of these three questions, and this is a two-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Montana girl. I love buffalo. I think they're so badass and just so cool. And so I have seen them in the wild. And if you're going to Yellowstone, I recommend going in April or May when there's all the new baby buffalo because they are golden. They're this light color that you wouldn't expect, and they're really cute.
All right, very cool. I do remember at least your response to that one because you were the only one who mentioned buffalo at the time. So I do at least remember that answer. So good. I'm glad.
Still a fan.
All right. Well, Rachel, that's it. That's all the questions that I have for you today. But, like I mentioned, we're barely scratching the surface here. So let's just recap one more time where our listeners can go and connect with you. And, if they have any follow-up questions. So once again, social media, website, what do you got for us?
All of it is Ally Safety. So whether any social media, you'll find me there, and then allysafety.com.
All right. And like I mentioned, there'll be links in the description for this. If anyone's watching the video on YouTube, the description down below, you'll find links. And you'll also find the links in the show notes for this episode if you're listening to the audio. All right. Well, Rachel, I want to thank you very much for taking the time for joining me on the podcast yet again. It's just been great to connect with you and form this friendship with you these last couple of years. And I'm glad that, we were able to meet up this summer down here in my new city of San Antonio.
Yeah.
But, I just appreciate you and, the work that you're doing. So keep at it, my friend.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been nice to talk to you again.
All right. Right on.